Thank you, Burton, and good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Deirdre Bishop, and I'm the Chief of the Geography Division at the U.S. Census Bureau. In the Geography Division, we have about 200 subject matter experts, geographers, statisticians, a few demographers, and then we have about 100 IT staff that support our work in developing a comprehensive address list. Burton mentioned our goal, to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. By the time we reach the 2020 census, we estimate there will be more than 330 million people living in over 140 million housing units. In Geography Division, it's our responsibility to make sure that every one of those 140 million housing units is in the right place. So that in the right place part of the sentence is critical for the work that we do. How do we establish a comprehensive database that can support the taking of the census? We do that through the development of a national address list and a national spatial database. We call our address list the master address file, and we call our spatial database, or our set of electronic maps, TIGER, the topologically integrated geographic encoding and referencing system. And you can see why we really only refer to it as TIGER. The MAF and TIGER form a system of geographic data that we continually update, and we use that information to invite people to respond to the census, and then to collect, tabulate, and disseminate their data in the correct geographic location. Burton mentioned that we've been building this address list for a long time. I just celebrated my 23rd anniversary at the Census Bureau. Throughout my career, I've been managing geographic operations, and I can firmly say that as we enter the 2020 census, our address list and our spatial database is in better shape than ever. Why do I believe that? Let's talk about it a little bit this morning. We've been continually updating our geographic information through a number of partnership and geographic programs. First, let's talk about our Geographic Support System program and the partnerships that we've developed throughout the process. Our most important partnership in the Geography Division is with the United States Postal Service for two reasons. First, because every year they send us a copy of their delivery sequence file, their address list that they use to deliver mail. We compare that delivery sequence file against our master address file, and we've been doing this throughout the decade 2 times a year. You can see here the numbers, and really I'm not going to step through any of the numbers on all of these slides, but I just want you to see the magnitude of the data that we're working with and the number of updates we're making on a routine basis. Every year, we're adding over 500,000 new addresses on average from data coming in from the United States Postal Service. The other reason our partnership is important with the USPS is because they're going to be delivering the mail for us as we invite people to respond to the census. Over 500 million packages of mail will be delivered through the United States Postal Service in 2020. We've also spent a lot of time forming relationships with tribal, state, and local governments. In the past, we'd wait until the 7-year or the 8-year of the decade to update our address list. But as we entered this decade, we said, why aren't we partnering with our tribal, state, and local governments more frequently? And so we put in an initiative and received funding to start that work in 2013. We used the census tract as our unit of measurement and had a goal to reach out and acquire 15,000 census tracts worth of address and spatial data from our partners each year. We were successful in that effort, as you can see here. Between 2013 and 2017, we were able to reach out to our partners throughout the country. And the only year we did not meet our goal was 2014, because we had to make a few changes due to budget constraints, but we caught up later on. Through that relationship with our tribal, state, and local governments, we received over 134 million records through this partnership. And we were able to accept just under 107 million records because those addresses met our definition of a housing unit. Some local governments are keeping all sorts of geographic information in their files, lamp post, fire hydrants. Sometimes they send that to us. We don't accept that type of information. We're only interested in the housing units. When we matched those 107 million address records from our partners against the master address file, over 99.5% of the addresses matched the Census Bureau's math. That makes me feel very good. In addition, we added over 520,000 new addresses from our partners throughout this process. And important to the concept of counting the people in the right place, throughout the process, we were able to collect 125 million distinct XY coordinates, lat-long coordinates from our partners that we could link to our addresses in our database. And using their information, we either corrected the spatial accuracy of our points or created new points 75 million times. Some people say to me, well, what's the value of this partnership if you're matching so many addresses against the master address file? To me, this is critical because this is the first decade in which we've had this information, this type of metrics, going into the census. We can say right now, based on partner data, we are validating the quality of addresses in the master address file. Also critical to ensuring that we count people in the right place is the location of the boundaries, the legal boundaries that we maintain. As per the Office of Management and Budget, we at the Census Bureau are the federal keepers of legal boundaries throughout the United States. So all federal governments come to us when it's time to look for accurate and authoritative boundaries. Each year we establish a metric, a performance metric, and we reach out to over 40,000 units of local government to say, do you have any changes to your boundaries? Our performance metric was this year was 85% for fiscal year 18, and I'm pleased to say that over 89% of those surveyed responded to us. Now, most of those, over 90%, said the quality of the boundaries are accurate, we have no changes. Just under 10% said, oh, we have an annexation, we have a change that we'd like to submit to the Census Bureau, and they did so, and we're making those changes. Yes? Yes, I mentioned that we reach out to about 40,000 units of government. Ideally, we'd like to be reaching out to 50 states, saying please send boundaries for all local governments within your states. In 11 states, we have an agreement or a memorandum of understanding in which they are the aggregator of all the boundaries in their states. They work with the local governments, and then they submit on behalf of the governments to the Census Bureau. Moving forward, we'd like to establish more of those relationships, but as you can imagine, some local governments say, we like to be in charge of our boundaries. Mm-hmm. Thanks for the question. I'm stepping through a few of what I consider to be the most important geographic operations, and I think this operation has received the most attention as we've headed into 2020. You may remember that as we prepared for the 2010 census, we hired over 150,000 address listers to validate the quality of our address list. They walked around every block in the nation validating the quality of our master address file. As we planned for the 2020 census, we said there's a way we can do this work much more efficiently. We can use satellite imagery now. We have that accessible in the office. We're comparing two different vintages of satellite imagery, one set from 2009 and one set from today, very current data. And we're looking at that in relation to counts we have in the master address file. Does the block appear stable? Is there change? Do we need to acquire additional data? We kicked off this program in September of 2015. We looked at over 11 million census blocks in the nation, comparing satellite imagery and the master address file. We did one first pass of the nation and completed early on June 8th of 2017. At that point, we were able to categorize 71% of the census blocks in the nation as stable. There had been no change throughout the decade, and I think for a lot of us, that's easy to imagine. The block in which I grew up on, in upstate New York, has not changed in 40 years. For those other areas, we classified 17% as active or experiencing change. We could see that in the imagery, and about 12% as on hold. We needed to acquire better satellite imagery or additional information to make an informed decision. Before I move on, I think it's important to mention that the Census Bureau is the largest civilian consumer of imagery coming from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency. And that goes to show just another way in which we're partnering with our federal agencies. Okay, since 2017, we've continued our work in in-office address canvassing, and we've conducted what we call a series of triggers. Anytime we have information that could alert a change or signify a change in our database, we send the census block back through a review. What type of information could cause a change? Number one, information in the change of a city boundary. We better go and make sure that the housing units are on the right side of the boundary. Or information coming in from the delivery sequence file. Is there an area where specifically a lot of change is occurring? Yes?
Just going back to the previous question, when you said that you identified that 71% are basically unchanged,
Yes.
does that mean that you send human canvassers to the remaining 29%?
That was our plan at the time. It's still our plan. So we've enhanced our work since 2017, and now we've been able to classify 86% of the census blocks as passive or stable, okay? Now, we have to make a few translations, and I'm going to talk about that in 1 minute as we finalize our workload. The last partnership program that I'd like to focus on today is LUCA, because this often receives a lot of attention in the press and from our local government partners. You may know that our address list is protected by Title 13 of United States Code. We maintain a national address list, but we're not allowed to share our addresses. There's one exception, and that is mandated by law as part of the Local Update of Census Addresses program. At this point in the decade, we can share our address list with our local, tribal, state partners as long as they sign the same confidentiality agreements and adhere to the same requirements that we at the Census Bureau do. This decade, we invited about 40,000 governments to participate in LUCA. 11,550 governments registered to review our address list. You may say, well, that's only a quarter of the governments, but that 11,550 represented 98% of the population and 98% of the housing units, because in many instances, again, a state decided they were going to review for all the entities within their state. Our process for review has concluded, and we received 8,389 responses from our partners, about 73% of those that registered. And for those that submitted information to us, 81.6% had changes, 18.4%, oh, Census Bureau, your address list looks great, we have no changes to submit. As the submissions came into the Census Bureau, they included over 22 million records. Our hope was that they would only be sending us our new addresses, but you can imagine some governments sent their entire file to us, and we're going through and processing the results now. I'm happy to say that of those 8,389 that submitted, their submission represents almost 96% of the population and housing units, so coverage is still very good. We will offer feedback to our government partners as to what we did with each one of their addresses, and they will have an opportunity, as mandated by law, to appeal any of the decisions we made. Okay, so I mentioned that our address list is in the best shape ever, and we've been continually updating our address list and spatial database throughout the decade. There are still some places where we'd like to have boots on the ground, eyes out in the field, validating the quality of the address list. If you've paid attention to our program management reviews, you'll recall at the last one, we announced the universe for our in-field address canvassing effort, which is going to start later this summer. And right now, we will be sending about 48 million of the 140 plus million to the field for validation. This amounts to about 34.7% of the housing units in the nation. And what would a presentation from someone in the geography division be without showing some maps? And so I wanted you to know that we currently have geographic products available for you to see and to use. You don't have to wait until the census is over to see these. There are two examples on the next slide. The first is our ROAM application, our Response Outreach Area Mapper. This application uses data from the American Community Survey and from the Census Bureau's planning database to highlight areas where we believe there will be low response to the census. Our partnership specialists, community leaders, others in the field can use this tool to direct their outreach efforts. The example on the bottom half of the slide is Tiger Web. This is our mapping application where you can view and download all of the Census Bureau's spatial information. And finally, we will still continue to produce paper maps in support of some of our operations, mostly related to our redistricting data program, which we'll hear more about from James. But our congressional district maps are always a big hit with those on the Hill, and our state legislative district maps are used by our state legislatures, people in the states, to help with them with the redistricting process. Thank you for your attention. Go ahead.
So, do you keep track of whether an address is occupied or vacant? If so, how often is it updated? And is there sort of any estimate on how much is spent mailing census forms to vacant units?
We in the Geography Division do not track that information. However, that question will be asked as part of the 2020 census. And when we send the letters of invitation to the households, we will be making note of which are vacant through that process. And you'll hear more about that from Al this morning. Mm-hmm. Yes?
I'd like you to go back and talk about Providence, Pierce County, and Bluefield, Beckley.
Yes.
So these were testing sites, as I understand it.
Yes.
So why were they selected,
Uh-huh.
and how were they selected? And Providence County, Rhode Island, was the end-to-end,
Yes.
the end-to-end test.
Yeah.
Okay. And I'd like to know why. I mean, why and how, and was the logic or the methodology?
Okay. I can talk to you from an address list development perspective because we did select those three sites, Washington, West Virginia, and Providence, Rhode Island, to best account for how our address list operations would occur in the field using different situations. So Providence is a urban area. How did our address listers do when they went out to validate the quality of the address list in the field? In West Virginia, we knew that there would be problems with connectivity, internet connectivity. How did our device do, and how did our listers respond during that process? And the same in Washington. We selected those sites from an address list perspective because they offered different characteristics that we could use to validate our plans for the 2020 census.
Yeah, I was just gonna add to that Providence itself actually demographically mirrors the country, and we thought it was ideal for that perspective. And remember, the end-to-end test was designed to test the integration, execution, implementation of our operations and our systems. So Providence was a good location for us to do that complete implementation of our operations and systems, and it was chosen for that reason. But it also demographically had many of the same characteristics as the whole country. John is going to talk.
John?
I think it's important to note that throughout the decade, the Census Bureau did testing around the United States in different areas. So they were in Los Angeles, they were in Houston in certain areas, they were in South Carolina, they were in Washington, D.C. The idea was to make sure that they touched a number of areas with different demographic characteristics, and also in different Census Bureau regional offices. So every part of the Census Bureau could participate in the buildup in some way. They couldn't do the whole country, but they did try to spread it around. So the 18 test was the end of it, but it wasn't the only way that they had looked at the United States in terms of testing something.
Yeah, I've got a question.
how are you going to handle the hiring of all these people? And if this isn't the right time, let me know. With the economy so good. Okay. Okay, good.
How did the gathering of addresses work in tribal communities? Because I know a lot of the reservations, we don't have addresses. I mean, how did you go about it? Because you said you partnered with different tribal governments.
Yes.
And I saw the number was really low, and so I'm really curious about that, about how that process went about that process.
We offer the same opportunity to tribal governments as we do to our state and local governments. In many instances, we did have tribal governments sign up for the local update of census addresses or our geographic support system partnership program, and they were able to submit addresses to the Census Bureau. I don't have all the details with me today, of course, but I'm happy to share those with you. I think the slide that you're referring to related to the boundary and annexation survey, where we had low tribal participation, and that seems to be a trend, but we are working very closely with the Bureau of Indian Affairs and with our tribal governments as we head into the 2020 census to make sure those geographies, those spatial boundaries for the tribes, the reservations, are accurate.
I wanted to add that the way we do the census in Indian country and tribal areas is to work with each government to figure out the best way to do the census in that area. So I talked last night, I was going to talk more about the update leave operation, where we actually walk all the streets and identify the housing units and add them to our address list, then leaving a package that they can respond with. We do that operation in a lot of the tribal areas. We also do an update enumerator operation, which is even more aggressive on the ground, that Al talks about. And it's all worked out in the agreements that we reach with the tribal governments about what's best for their area. So some of them are in the self-response, the traditional way we do the census, more than ever, because of this work that Deirdre described that allowed for the development of an address list in those areas. But where there's no address list, we do a different operation.
Hi, can you talk a little bit about the software that you use or the process to look and identify blocks that have either changed or not changed? How long did that take?
Sure. We created an application in-house. We call it BARCA. We have all these long acronyms. The Block Application Research Classification Assessment Tool. And that BARCA application allows us to view two different vintages of satellite imagery. One from 2009. That imagery we had maintained on an imagery server in the Geography Division, and then current imagery that's streaming in from the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency on a daily basis. In addition, we have been able to collect aerial imagery from the Farm Service Agency, the National Agricultural Imagery Program, NAEP. And we've been using that information to supplement decisions that we're making using the imagery from NGA.
How much is it computing time versus people time? How often would you say, roughly, that you're just putting the data into a system and saying match, no match, versus eyeballing it? How much time does it take to actually go through that process?
Sure. What used to take 2.5 hours in the field for someone to walk around a census block and validate the quality of the address list is now taking under 2 minutes to do that same work in the office. So when you think that we're classifying about 65% of the addresses as stable heading into 2020, that's going to be a significant difference in time and resources. Time to wrap up.
Yeah, so I don't know if this is something that's going to be gotten into in a later discussion on harder to reach places, but I'm curious how something like mobile homes would fit into this. Like, obviously, it seems understandable enough if there's a park where you have like stationary trailers, but if people are literally like traveling around in an RV, say, how would that be accounted for and avoid the double counting issue?
In many instances, we have those mobile home locations classified in our address list. In other cases, we're going to conduct special operations as part of the 2020 census to account for those, and Al will cover those in detail. Okay.
Hi. I'm sorry if you already answered this question, but those 40,000 state, local, tribal governments that you partner with,
Yep.
are those, is that public knowledge of like what those are, or where those are?
Every incorporated place or legal entity within the United States is invited to participate in our geographic programs. So state, the 50 states, the 3,200 or so counties, and then all of the incorporated places, townships, place, et cetera. Oh, for the boundary and annexation survey, yes, I can share those. I know Kentucky, Wisconsin, I don't know them all off the top of my head. I think they are. Let me check the link when I sit down, and then I'll share it with you afterwards. I think in the interest of time, we
Yep.
need to move on.
Very
Okay,
good. Thank you.